Здравствуйте. Hello, and welcome back to our online lecture series on for International Forum of Journalists, Russia-Africa, the way of friendship and cooperation. This project is conducted by Альфа-Диалог Center with the support of Горчакова Fund. And we continue our lecture, and today we discuss Russian culture. And one of the key goals of our forum is to broaden perspectives and foster understanding between Russia and Africa. And what better way to do that than to delve into the rich cultural landscape of Russia. Today we have the pleasure of welcoming Yulia Savikovskaya, an expert in this field. Yulia, thank you for sharing your expertise with us. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much. I will try to make this discussion as informal as possible, and you're welcome to ask me questions in the end and to contact me through email. You can see it here on the slide. And I thought that, of course, if we think of Russian culture, I'm not only thinking about novels, poetry, and drama. Of course, it's also music, art, architecture. But I thought that as I'm the playwright and the translator, and I have been writing book reviews for quite a while, I thought I would concentrate on culture as the written culture of Russia. Here I must mention that maybe as well as in Ethiopia, because I have read it has 87 languages. The same is true for Russia. The statistics say that we have in the Russian Federation there are 297 languages, but Russian is the language for written culture, and maybe in the world Russian culture is well known for novels and plays written in Russian only. But I just wanted to make this clear that there are many people here that can talk other languages. It's kind of has become a tradition. It's well known that the Russian nation is a well-read nation. There are many libraries, book clubs. Reading is not just a hobby, it's a way of self-education, self-formation, and of course in schools you spend many years learning Russian literature, and it is sort of a bad kind of sign, a bad a thing not to know the main novelists of the 19th and 20th century, and I guess the cultured person in Russia is defined by his or her ability to quote some of the texts, to recognize them when they are mentioned or quoted. So I guess it's a continuous process, and you might ask me where to start, right? So this 40 minutes of our talk now will be dedicated to me guiding you in your experience of discovering Russian written culture. And I guess the way to start would be to think whom I know already. Here I have looked at the list of the novelists and writers who are mostly well known abroad. Here I guess I will mention the names that you might have read and heard about. Of course, it's Leo Tolstoy, Fyodor Dostoevsky, Anton Chekhov, Vladimir Nabokov. And the reason for Nabokov, as you might know, it's the writer of the 20th century. He has lived his maybe 2/3 of his life in the United States. So a part of his novels, and maybe actually the major part, are written in English language. So if you want to read a Russian writer, not in translation, you can start with Nabokov, because it's a unique case where Lolita, of course, and many other texts are written by this writer in English. Well, in the top 10 of well-known are also Joseph Brodsky. He was the Soviet poet who also moved to the United States at some point, because he was actually asked to leave in 1972, but he received the Nobel Prize. He died, well, relatively recently, and he's a very mythological, symbolical figure actually for my city, St. Petersburg, so you might have heard of him. Actually, thinking of Nobel laureates, I've mentioned one. There are 4 Nobel laureates that are Russian. Mostly for, I think maybe the most famous, it will be Boris Pasternak, and I actually have his novel here. His most famous novel is Dr. Zhivago. Actually, not only the most famous, but it is the only one, because he is a poet and a translator, and he hasn't written much in prose, but he got the Nobel Prize for this novel in 1958 with a scandalous story of him forced to refuse the Nobel Prize, and actually having some difficulties in his life after the fact that he received the Nobel Prize. Interesting to mention that Pasternak lived in the suburb of Moscow, and actually, if we think of the centers of the Russian written culture, of course, they are St. Petersburg and Moscow. And now modern writers like me could go to a residency in Peredelkino, this, well, a suburb of Moscow, where you could try to write your own stuff. So somehow the memory of Pasternak is kept through this residency. And to other Nobel Prize winners, so I've mentioned Joseph Brodsky, he's the most recent one. Pasternak was the third, I think, and Ivan Bunin and Mikhail Sholokhov were 2 other Nobel Prizes. With Bunin, I have here his text. He has very famous cycles of short stories. It's the most famous one, called The Dark Alleys, and he has several novels. And the interesting fact about him, now we can see, is a trend that he also lived the major part of his life abroad in France. Well, not the major, actually, the last part. He went to exile after the October Revolution. And I will mention this break between the emigre writers and the ones who stayed in Russia at some point later. And the third Nobel Prize winner is Mikhail Sholokhov. It might not be the first choice to begin with. His novel Silently Flows the Dawn. It's about the civil war in Russia of the beginning of the 20th century. But for example, my grandfather was a Cossack, and he read this huge volume 10 times. So it's a novel which is read in schools. It's one of the major milestones. Silently Flows the Dawn. But I know a German friend who has read this novel. I think from my friends abroad, nobody yet has ventured into it. So you are very welcome. So we get back to the famous ones you could begin with. I mentioned for Nobel Prize winners, because it's always good for your ego, say, to know the Nobel Prize winners and their texts and to mention them in the conversations. From the modern writers, the famous, the known ones are the ones who were long listed for International Booker Prize. It's a prize in the UK, and it tries to promote the translations of the authors from the foreign countries who have been translated into English. And here we have Vladimir Sorokin. He, I think, is still alive. He's like maybe 65. Marina Stepanova, a poet and a writer, her book in A Memory of a Memory was recently longlisted for a Booker Prize, and Lyudmila Ulitskaya, she's well translated into many languages. But here is the list of sort of the names you might have heard of. I'm maybe on purpose not going into Tolstoy and Dostoevsky because they are the major figures. You might discover them yourself. I will try to maybe guide you into some less known names, but I will mention them maybe later. And I guess, well, we kind of begin the knowledge of the Russian literature. Every kid knows the name of Alexander Pushkin. So we could say that our literature is relatively young because Pushkin was killed on a duel in 1837, and the Russian literature starts with the beginning of the 19th century, and say its history is now sort of less than 200 years. And with Pushkin, it's interesting that he's considered not easy to translate. So I guess with Pushkin you could start with, but I have found a translation of Eugene Onegin. It's called A Novel in Verse. Somehow it's called a novel, but it's in verse. You might know it by the opera of Tchaikovsky. So it has been given sort of the PR in the world. And I guess it would be interesting for you, especially if you know the opera, to read this novel in translation. It's translated by Walter Arndt, and I guess there are others, so it is translatable. And I have the small one, it's in Russian. They have now they try to print it in the way Pushkin was writing, because we had a difference in orthography of the language till the October Revolution. So sometimes they try to reprint it in the old type of orthography. Actually, I must mention that it's maybe a myth also about Russian writers that they knew nothing but Russian language. It's not true. Say Pushkin was excellently versed in French. Many writers knew 5 or 6 languages, like Nabokov could write in them, lived abroad for a long time. So it's interesting. I think it's very symptomatic for Russian writers to be open to the travels to other countries, and we are not the closeted Russian culture. The writers have experience of the world as well. And with Pushkin, whom here in this field, it's a field that it's the period that comes before Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. You could think of Griboyedov. Alexander Griboyedov, he is most famous by his play, and maybe with plays I will finish with playwrights, so I will now skip them. Mikhail Lermontov is also the writer who died young at the age of 27, and here is the myth I should mention. The myth, well, and it's actually partly true, and it's a big myth of the Russian writer that he dies young, he or she dies young, he or she is, well, it's mostly he for the 19th century, is killed in some accident. For example, Griboyedov was killed in Iran during the riot, and he was killed so that no full parts of his body were found. Pushkin was killed on a duel. Lermontov was killed on a duel, and there are more cases in the 20th century. Say, if you might know, there is a poet that I'm fond of. Sergei Yesenin is the poet of the 20th century. He died of suicide at the age of 30. Mayakovsky, the Soviet poet, also, he died at the age of 34, I think. 36 also of the suicide. So it's kind of a myth that Russian writer is the suffering soul. Even for Dostoevsky, he is known to have been engaged in what's the name? In gambling. He has the novel The Gambler. So somehow writing is somehow associated with a premature death and bad habits. But I assure you that is not always the case, and we, the modern writers, we don't go into the field of writing with the goal of committing suicide or dying young. We all aim to live till 90 and write our novels and plays. But I wanted to mention this, that there were many writers in Russian culture who left us early. And actually, the interesting case here would be Nikolai Gumilev, the poet of the 20th century, who was killed by, well, we would say by a KGB, by the Soviet regime in 1921. He was accused of the plot against the Soviet regime. And here I'm jumping between the 19th century and the 20th century, but he's important also that he died as the victim of the regime, but I mention him on purpose. He is maybe the one that you should also put on your list, because he spent 2 or 3 years in Abyssinia, which, as I understand, it is how Ethiopia was called before Eritrea separated from it. And he has an African diary with pictures, with his impressions of his voyage. And I have read that he was the one who made a photo of the last emperor of Ethiopia. So you should look into him, and I can send you, if you write to me, I can send you a link with the article that has the pictures of Ethiopia made by this famous poet of the 20th century. What is also the trend for the Russian writers is to get united into some sort of unions, organizations. It's not true that they were writing alone, secluded from the world in some kind of a monastery. It wasn't true for Pushkin's time, and it wasn't true for the 20th century time. Actually, we call the Pushkin's time the golden age of Russian literature, and the beginning of the 20th century the silver age of the Russian literature. And for both periods, it was symptomatic to have literary circles, meetings, readings, the journals, say, Современник, it's a famous magazine of the 19th century, where the translations were published, all new writers appeared, and the critics actually were formed through the literary magazines. It's a very Russian tradition. They are called, well, they still exist. There are several literary magazines in the modern Russia, and it's prestigious to begin your publications in them and then maybe have a book. So it's also an interesting part of the Russian tradition. So in the silver age of Russian culture in the 20th century, we had many organizations of poets and writers, the symbolists, acmeists, imaginists, futurists. For example, Mayakovsky was a futurist, and you might know him also because he was promoted after his death. So he became the poet of the Soviet times. For example, my grandparents met at the dispute dedicated to the poetry of Mayakovsky. In the USSR, every family had his books on his shelves. While, say, Yesenin, he belonged to Imaginism. It's another a union that was functioning. So I wanted to mention this. It is also important to know that the writers, maybe now as well, used to function as groups, and they like to participate in discussions and meetings with their readers. As it is now, we have many literary festivals for modern writers. Say, recently in Moscow, we had nonfiction festival where you could meet authors, buy new books. But I guess it's normal for the literary process in every country. As I mentioned, I would also say that the trend for some writers was to make a choice whether to live in Russia or to move abroad. And of course, here is if in the 19th century many writers just traveled. So even Dostoevsky, if you might know, he wrote some of his novels in Baden-Baden. I think he lived for quite a while. So he wrote some of his novels from Germany. It's the same is true for Turgenev. Ivan Turgenev is also the writer of the 19th century that you might not have heard of, but he is well known in the school program and has very good short stories and novels. Also, Nikolai Gogol, I should mention him. It's also the 19th century. He spent the major part of his life in Italy, in Rome, and it didn't stop him from writing his most famous, his chef-d'oeuvre, The Dead Souls, from Rome. And when I was in Rome, there is a plaque mentioning this. Actually, Gogol wrote The Dead Souls in Rome. And after, say, in the Soviet times, after the October Revolution, say, the factor for deciding to go abroad, of course, was the fact whether you accepted the Soviet rule or you didn't. And from the ones I mentioned, we have immigrants like Ivan Bunin, then the poet Marina Tsvetaeva, she committed suicide as well. Then the one that I think you should begin with, it's Evgeny Zamyatin. Actually, I forgot to mention that if you, after my lecture, put something on the top of your list to read, I would actually say this. You should read We by Evgeny Zamyatin. I was honored to translate his biography. I'm showing you the book I have translated, but it will be easier for you to read it in Russian. And his novel We is written in the 20th century, is the precursor of the modern dystopian novel. And even George Orwell mentioned that he actually takes his inspiration for dystopian writing from Zamyatin. So the dystopia We is something that should be definitely on your list. It's very modern. It is not about Russia. It's actually interesting that Zamyatin might have based his dystopia on his visit to Britain. He was a naval engineer, and the writer of this book that I translated, she insists that he actually saw the vision of mechanical dystopian world in Britain. And that's why, as you remember, I began with the fact that Russian writers were very open to the world observations as well. Well, from the ones who moved abroad, we also have Nabokov, Brodsky, but much later also Sergei Dovlatov. He's the writer also of the late 20th century. he is well known in Russia, but I might think that his writing might be, well, maybe not the first choice for you to read. But maybe the second choice after We, I think, would be to read a very occult novel of the 20th century. It's the one by Mikhail Bulgakov, The Master and Margarita. I remember a friend wrote to me at 3 a.m. saying that he couldn't stop and he just was immersed in reading this novel. It's about the Stalinist Russia visited by the devil. Well, that's maybe could be a punchline for this novel. I think it could be your second reading after We by Zamyatin. Then you can go to Dr. Zhivago, also mentioned by me, and then you could continue by the choice of your own. I wanted to mention the playwriting, and here, of course, the name that you might know, and in a way, it's the playwright who represents Russia in the world of drama today. Is, of course, Anton Chekhov. I must mention that he is not the only one. Of course, Gogol, the author of The Dead Souls, whom I mentioned, he is also the famous playwright, and his play, The Government Inspector, might be seen on the world stages. I've seen it several times. There was also Alexander Ostrovsky in the 19th century. His plays were mainly about the merchants in Russia, about the lives of men and women in not in the capitals, but say in the middle of Russia. And somehow he's not so easily understood by the audiences abroad. But Chekhov, of course, is named as Russian Shakespeare and is staged as often as Shakespeare on the world stages. And actually, I'm the researcher of the British versions of Anton Chekhov's plays. So I can't even tell you how to approach him, because he just sort of made a new step in the drama of the 20th century on the whole, and his plays are The Seagull, Uncle Vanya, The Cherry Orchard, and Three Sisters. And there are some others, but these four are his most famous ones. And I'm sure it will be easier for me not to tell you the plots of them, but actually to ask you to see the repertoire theaters in the countries you will visit or you live in. And I'm 100% sure that you will have the opportunity to see one of his plays in the language of the country you live in. I've seen his plays in French, in German, in English, and he died from tuberculosis, continuing the trend of early deaths. He was 44, I think. Yes, and we still continue to research his plays, but also with Anton Chekhov, you could begin with his short stories. He didn't write novels, he wrote plays and short stories, and there are several volumes of his short story collection, and I think it could be your third choice of reading, recommended by me after We and The Master and Margarita. I wanted also to mention the mythology of the city. I'm from St. Petersburg, and I'm sure that there are many novels and poems that are dedicated to Moscow, but here I am biased, and I would talk about the myth of St. Petersburg in Russian literature. And here, of course, Pushkin would be the one. Eugene Onegin begins in St. Petersburg. there is a poem, The Bronze Horseman by Pushkin, that is a mystery story where Peter I becomes alive. It's also based in St. Petersburg. The novels by Fyodor Dostoevsky, as you know, here we come to the famous writer from Russia, are also mainly based in St. Petersburg. And interestingly enough, you could begin, if you visit St. Petersburg, you could do a tour of the places where, say, Raskolnikov killed the lady, where this character lived, where this character lived. So we have the geography of Dostoevsky in the center of St. Petersburg. And I would recommend you to read his less well-known, it's a novel, I think also, well, it's short. It's called The White Knights. So if you want to go on the non-so well-trod a path in Dostoevsky, I would recommend to read. But of course, he's a crime and punishment, and the brothers Karamazov. But he's the one sort of responsible for the myth of St. Petersburg, as well as Nikolai Gogol, who has the cycle of stories that are based in St. Petersburg. And of course, this myth, due to Dostoevsky and to Gogol and maybe to Pushkin, the myth of St. Petersburg in literature is a place where you could lose your mind, you could commit crimes, you live in poverty, but you are transcending the reality and you meet the fantasy worlds. Your nose can go loose, as in the novel The Nose by Gogol. By the way, there is an opera by Shostakovich, so you could look at or listen to it. So it's a story where the nose leaves the owner, and he is an officer just functioning by himself. But in the end, we're not sure whether it was a fantasy of the principal character or a true story. So St. Petersburg, it's myth in the literature that it's a place for mythology to become true, for your worst fantasies and fears to be realized. As I mentioned in The Bronze Horseman, Peter I follows Evgeny, the character threatening to kill him. Actually, I have a plan of writing a play that would sort of play with the myth of St. Petersburg. I wanted to call it The Bitter Horseman. So it's the myth of St. Petersburg is treated in the modern Russian literature in postmodern sense, that it is played with, quoted, and transformed. The example is the famous novel by Andrei Bitov. Well, you might not read in Russian. It's called The Pushkin House. And here we have, it's happening in the 70s in St. Peter, in Leningrad, as it was called then, and the chapters are called as quotes from the writers I mentioned, from Pushkin, from Lermontov, from Gogol. So it is a postmodern take on St. Petersburg mythology. So that was important for me to mention, because as a modern playwright and writer, you have to be aware of the figures that I have talked about today, to be able not to invent the bicycles on the one hand, but on the other to use the postmodern game of changing the existing cultural texts and to transform them into your own writing. And I will dedicate the last 5-7 minutes to describing you the modern literary life. Well, I guess it's easy to be part of it as long as you are active and you send your short stories, your novels, your plays to competitions. There are many open calls. There are festivals of play readings in Moscow, in St. Petersburg. So the life now is more fractured, I guess, so that we don't have one big figure that we all follow, and it's good. It's good to be among your colleagues, try to send your works to the publishing houses, try to participate in the competitions of prose, of poetry, of playwriting. Say, 2 of my plays have been highlighted through such competitions, and being in the shortlists gave me the chance, say, to be staged. So it's the way for doing your career, and you could see your play staged, or you could see your novel in the publishing house. But I guess it would be maybe after 3 or 4 years of researching the literature of the 20th and 19th century that I recommend you to venture into the modern literary process, because I guess it needs some preparation. As I said, it's very diverse. You have to be in the business, so to call, of writing or of reading for many years to find your route through the dozens of things that are written in the modern time and day. Well, the interesting thing also with Pushkin, I wanted to mention it. It will be interesting for you. We all know that his grandparent came from either Abyssinia or Cameroon. It's a well-known fact, and it's an interesting African connection. The beginning of the Russian literature has with Africa. So I hope actually that this connection will be widened and improved through such forums, through your writing about the Russian culture and us writing about Ethiopian culture. I'm very interested to know more, and if there is a possibility for me to review a novel from your country, I'm open to it. So, and maybe the last thing I wanted to recommend, I have it here actually. Yeah. An interesting thing that there is a play by the British playwright Tom Stoppard called The Coast of Utopia. It's actually a play of 3 plays, and it's about the Russian culture of the 19th century. It has as its characters the figures I have mentioned today. It has Turgenev, and it is a very interesting also book. It's a play, like the 3 plays that could show you how the modern a British writer, after 5 years of research, sees the cultural process of the development of Russian thought, of Russian criticism of the politics in Russia in the 19th century. It's not the time of Pushkin and Gogol, it's more the time, actually, the beginner of Dostoevsky's time, it's more the time of Turgenev, of Nekrasov, so the mid-19th century. So this book would be also on my list, on top 5 for you to read, to know more about Russian culture, because it's a paradox that at the Coast of Utopia, this play is a very a famous piece of modern writing dedicated to Russia. And here I might stop, because we could spend 20 minutes in a conversation and the questions. Thank you for your attention.
Yulia, thank you so much for this fascinating and comprehensive overview of Russian culture and Russian literature. If someone have a question, please raise your hand, or you can type it in the question section, please, and we will let you ask. Yes, please, Mohammed, you're welcome to speak.
Thank you very much, and I would like to thank you for this informative and transformative session indeed. It's very full of insights about the Russian culture, the Russian writing, and how the culture meets the society and at some point translates how the people live. But my question would be about how high concept could be translated in the Russian culture and the Russian writings. And by high concept, I would refer to Blake Snyder in his famous book, Save the Cat. He emphasizes on the pivotal role of stressing the high concept, that the writing itself can be entertaining for the soul and can be attractive for the audience, but how the high concepts can be translated in the Russian culture, the Russian writings, and how it can be understood by the one who would read it. For example, I'm reading The White Steamboat by Genghis Aytmatov, and I could see that there is a unique writing motion, moves from one idea to another, discussing a tradition of society, discussing a behavior of certain individuals. So I would appreciate your time into delving into these nuances and discussing how could be this well understood by someone who is reading Russian culture and literature for the first time. Thank you very much. Thank you once again.
I will try to rephrase your question so you might correct me, because I think I will try to say how I understood it. You want me to explain how the things that could be understood sort of without explanation for the Russian reader be picked up by the foreign reader when reading a Russian novel. Am I correct?
Indeed, yes, you're right. Thank you, Professor.
Well, yeah, that's a good it's a question I think we could put to any literature, right? So I guess to read, say, Balzac or Proust or Stendhal in French literature, we also have to conceptualize, to know, say, the life of the French society of that time. So I guess maybe if you take the author and you know the context when he lived, what was his writing about, you could begin maybe by some historical, by a short, brief guide to the period of history when this author lived, because indeed, not for all, but for many writers, their writing was contextualized in a particular time. But it might not fully help. As I said, for example, Silently Flows the Dawn, it's a very difficult reading because it indeed presumes that you have lived through or know the history of the Civil War. But I guess not knowing in the beginning wouldn't stop you from beginning to know as you read it, right? So give the novel a chance to include you in the context when you read it, and help yourself, say, even with Wikipedia, right? There is no one stopping you from Googling the author, saying what sort of the mass knowledge about this writer is, where he belongs in the time, in the chronology of literature, and then thinking, if I want to continue with him or her, then I guess I would just help myself with such Googling or with putting some questions to the Russian people I know. So there are some novels that do require additional work in contextualizing them. There is no escaping that. I hope I have answered, or you could put.
Well, your answer is quite outstanding. I wasn't expecting your answer to be that much simple, clear, but at the same time delving into something I was deeply thinking about, but I couldn't put it in a word. Okay, one last word about the hard concepts. At some point, the reader, or the writer, sorry, sometimes the writer would like to implant high concepts in the mind of the reader. So, in the White Steamboat, the writer, I believe, would discuss how their grandfather was so helpful to his village to the extent that he was undervalued. But that doesn't stop him from being so helpful to everyone who came to him. So that high concept of being helpful to others and other high concepts and the transformative process of the characters in the writing motion, how we can understand from all of this a culture that a person is willing to learn from.
Well,
I mean,
guess here,
yes, yes, please, Professor.
I guess here we could distinguish between the ideology that many Soviet novels unfortunately used to have, and between the morality that was put into the writing by the writer himself. So you wouldn't deny that we kind of gain from a crime and punishment the moral of not committing a crime, right? So you see how the character suffers through the novel and what happens to him, and maybe the young person would think twice before causing harm to someone. But ideology, say, of that, I don't know, the communist leader is the best and the rest are not so good, that was common for the Soviet literature. This one I would try to put aside. So actually I am aware that as a writer I'm trying to not to follow the kind of the literature that is too moralistic, ideological. So I prefer not to take the high concept from the literature. I prefer the literature which is more playful, has many facets, many points of view, and gives me a tapestry of characters, of thoughts, of opinions, without me gleaning the one high concept from it. So I wouldn't recommend you to try to find it in each piece of Russian writing. And the less high concepts you find, I might think the better, because I am against the moralism of the literature. I think it should try to avoid it.
Okay, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. And I really appreciate your insight. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your questions.
Thank you very much. We have another question for Julia.
Hello, yeah, thank you very much for the insightful information about the Russian culture and the Russian way of life. That's very, very important to know. Now, I have one question, Miss Yulia. In the Russian Empire, there was a poet called Rasputin in Russian Empire, very famous Rasputin. Even there is a song that has been sung about Rasputin by Boney M. Some Black Caribbean singers. They sang about Rasputin. And it is said that Rasputin, he was a friend to the Tsaritsina Ekaterina. And Tsaritsina Ekaterina was a friend to Rasputin, and the people in the Russian Empire were not very happy about this. So they killed Rasputin. Now, is this true that Rasputin, a poet in the Russian Empire, was killed by the people in the Russian Empire? And what kind of a picture does this bring out to the world if Rasputin was killed in the Russian Empire? And why was Rasputin killed in the Russian Empire by the Russian people?
Well, I'm slightly smiling because I know the song, and I was always surprised what kind of an image you might have of Rasputin if you have listened to the song. So thank you for the question. As far as I know, Rasputin hasn't written any poetry, but I do remember that in the song he's mentioned like a lover, yes, and a poet, but he was not a poet. He was more of a monk, of a spiritual leader who was close not to Ekaterina, but to the wife of Nikolai II, the last emperor. Her name was Alexandra Fedorovna, and he helped to heal her son. He had hemophilia. It is the disease when your blood runs without stopping, and he helped in some situations when this boy was feeling bad. He was helpful, and that's why he became a powerful figure. And many right fractions of the Russian elite were not satisfied with the way that this nobody, this strange man, say from peasants or from merchants, was influencing the Tsar through his medical ability to help his son. So in the end, indeed, there was a plot not by the Russian people, but by actually 4 representatives of the nobility. He was killed by the right-wing politician, by the Prince Felix Yusupov, and indeed they killed him. It's a very famous story. There is a Yusupov palace here in St. Petersburg where you could go on excursion and to hear about this murder, but he wasn't a poet, and he wasn't killed by Russian people. He was killed by 4 representatives of the elite who were not satisfied by his status. Well, I hope now you have your myth unwound.
Yeah, because the Boney M, the Caribbean black singers, they sang about Rasputin, and then they said, "Oh, those Russians." So you have to put it clear so that the people cannot say the Russians killed Rasputin, and a very famous writer.
Yes, and still Rasputin, and it's not only Boney M that used this myth. There are several films in the UK and in the States about Rasputin, but I always think that he's mythologized just to gain the interest of the public. But it's a very interesting story, and it's worth actually reading the facts about him. It's still a controversial story. It is known that he used to prepare himself for the murder. He kind of knew transcendentally that the attempts would be done, and he didn't die from the first attempt. So he was, I would say, he was a very strong religious person. But when I read about the poets of that period, he is not mentioned there.
All right, okay, that's very, very informative. Another small question I want to ask Yulia: was he a mixture of a Russian white person and a black person, Rasputin?
No. I think at that time it was very rare to have somebody of mixed origin, even say mixed European, Asian, or European, African. Before actually the Soviet times, I think in this way, in the race way, Russia was a closed country, and you, well, and I'm sure that he didn't have any other regions apart from, say, from the Eastern European ones.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Julia. Thank you very much, our dear participants. Yulia, we really thank you for the depth of your knowledge, and we truly appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us, and I think we can continue discussion, and if you have question, you can send to the email on the slide. And so I guess this was a wonderful opportunity to learn more and reflect on rich culture of Russia, both literally and historically. Yulia, thank you very much again for your time.
Yes,
and
are you all very welcome to ask more questions on my email. I would be looking forward to answering them, and to create new myths in your minds about Russia.
Yeah, thank you for unfolding Russia for our dear participants. Thank you very much. I end the session and hope to see you during our next lectures. До свидания.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.